So I see it's 6 o'clock, and so I'm calling the Longmont Transportation Advisory Board meeting to order for Monday, November the 8th, 2021. Could we have the roll call, please?
Andrew Stewart,
Did you say my name? Here.
Liz Osborne,
Here.
Courtney Michelle,
Here.
David McInerney,
Present.
Steve Lehner,
Here.
Councilmember Peck.
Here.
All right. Now I'd like us to approve the minutes from the September 2021 meeting. Did everybody get those and read those?
Yes.
May I have a motion to approve the minutes from September 2021?
I move that we approve the minutes from the September Transportation Advisory Board meeting.
Seconded.
Second by David. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor, raise your hands or say aye.
Aye.
All right. All right. Do we have communication from staff tonight?
I don't have any communications tonight.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Do we have any public invited to be heard?
I believe we do. See a call-in user on here and was also contacted by a resident.
Okay. Do I invite them to
I believe
Speak?
they're listening. It's like they're unmuted now.
Okay. Would you please state your name and your address?
Hello, my name is Diane Christ, and I'm at 2034 Mount Sneffels Street in Longmont.
Okay, Diane, we're listening.
Thank you. And I'm interested in joining the Transportation Board. I'm recently a candidate for City Council, and Joan Peck and I were in several debates together. I'm interested in transportation within the city, but also in the Hyperloop that is planned for the state of Colorado. And just in general, how our transportation needs are going to be met going forward, since I think transportation is one big issue that our city faces on many levels at this time. So I don't have comments for the board. I'm mostly interested in hearing what projects are in the works for the city.
Okay. Well, thank you, Diane, for joining us this evening.
Well, thanks for having me.
And can she just stay on and listen? Is that the way that works? Tyler?
Absolutely. Yeah, she can stay on and listen. If this is the opportunity for public comment. So if there's additional comments that come at the end of the meeting, the board could make a motion to final call, public invited to be heard if needed. And I was expecting another caller who I was emailing earlier in the day. Is that caller on? I don't see, so.
Okay.
Tyler, just to, do we have Diane's contact information?
She gave us her address.
I mean, at least so we can reach to her, and if she has questions regarding transportation, we can certainly provide those to her offline.
Sure.
All right, thank you.
Do we have what you need?
And, Diane, I guess if you'd like to reach out to me, please do so. Happy to provide my contact info, email, phone number, whatever is easiest for you. You're still on there.
Okay, Yes, I am. I think I have a email address for you, Tyler.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll email you my contact information.
Great, thank you.
All right. Or the action items, are there any action items that we need to discuss this evening before we go into information?
No action items tonight.
Okay. All right. Well, we are ready for the 2020 Longmont Annual Crash Report given by you and Carolyn Michaels.
All right, thank you for that. So Tyler Stamey, Transportation Engineering Administrator for the city, and with me tonight is Caroline Michael. She's a civil engineer in our group, and really a lot of the credit goes to her on this. She does a lot of the data crunching, a lot of the number work, a lot of the behind the scenes work to get this report together, to do the statistical analysis that we're going to talk about here tonight. So hats off to her and her efforts for this. With that, I'll go ahead and kick off. I'm going to share a screen and we'll go through some of the figures, some of the key findings from the report, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion at the end. All right, so each year, end of the year or sometime during the year, we compile all of the crash reports that happen in the city. So we get our source for the data, the crashes, is through our police department. Generally, each year we see quite a few crashes. The last handful of years, we've seen over 2,000 crashes per year. 2020, it turns out a global pandemic is good overall for crash numbers and also for the serious injury and other severe crashes. We saw a reduction of vehicle miles of travel on our roadways, and I would caution though that the crash number you see here is not exactly an apples to apples comparison to prior years. We had 1,220 reported crashes in Longmont. One of the big changes for 2020 was that City of Longmont was more or less on accident alert for most of the year. So that means any crash that didn't involve an injury or did not have alcohol or other drugs involved was reported to the state and not necessarily to our local police department. So in that instance, we don't have those records. So I would caution, it looks really good when we look at it on a graph here, but it is somewhat misleading in that we didn't get the full data set and we don't have that from the state. What we do have, what didn't change was, like I mentioned, the injury and the fatal crashes. The reporting on that did not change. So we still got all of those reports. And as you'll see here, our our injured or worse crashes are at the lowest level we've seen in Longmont since about 1996. So despite population going up, VMT, our total vehicle miles of travel on collector and arterial roadways, went down quite a bit in 2020. 354 million vehicle miles of travel in Longmont in 2020, which is about equal to about 2015. So if we're looking at a crash rate in 2015 versus 2020 for similar number of miles driven on our roadways, we're definitely seeing an improvement over that period and looking at that year in particular. This table and the last one are a little bit different than the ones that are in the report because it shows comparison to VMT, vehicle miles of travel, instead of to population. And so this is similar crash rates per million vehicle miles of travel. Again, the crash rate, take that with a grain of salt again. It's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. The injury or worse crash rate is down again. It's still, when we look back, the oldest data I have VMT for the city is back to 2004. So this is actually the lowest crash rate per vehicle miles of travel we've seen since 2004, which is a good indicator that I think a lot of our efforts are effective. We still have a ways to go. Our goal is always going to be 0 deaths in our community or 0 injuries, but we're definitely making some progress in terms of seeing a good trend here in 2020. Caroline, I'll turn it over to you here for a little bit to run through some of the of the fun statistics that you put together.
Hi, my name is Caroline Michael, engineer at the City of Longmont here. So I know the full crash report was sent out to everyone earlier, so this PowerPoint probably isn't going to go over every single graph and figure that was in that report, but we're going to try to hit some of the key items. So the pie chart here is showing all of the intersection crashes. And as a point of clarification on that as well, what we classify as an intersection crash is 2 public streets. So it actually does not include private driveways in this number. And usually the complete intersection, it's usually about 60% of crashes are at public street intersections, with the remaining 40% that are not. And of those, we have, of the intersection crashes, about 67% are at signals and 33% are at unsignalized intersections. So for all of our when do crashes happen data, some interesting trends kind of happened in 2020. But overall, the numbers haven't changed too much when we look at the larger scale from 16 to 20, because we're still seeing usually that evening PM peak from 5 to 6 is where we have most of our crashes happening, and also a pretty big spike from 3 to 4. Again, day of week hasn't changed. It's still mostly on Fridays. We're seeing the most, Sundays the least. I do think in 20 it was a bit of a higher incidence on Thursday compared to Friday, which might reflect some changes in commuting patterns with fewer people driving into work over there. And again, our crashes by month, kind of the same overall trend, with kind of the most happening in December and usually kind of towards the end of the year. But again, in that trend as well, you can really see the impact of COVID, because in 2020, I know that in January and February, the monthly number of crashes was pretty on track with like previous years, but it dropped pretty dramatically in March and April and never really went back up to comparable levels that we've seen in other years. We also track DUI and medical crashes. So DUI includes alcohol and drug impairment, and recreational marijuana was legalized in 2014. We did see a decrease in DUIs for the first time since 16, but it's still not that much of a decrease. We're still pretty high. And the medical kind of asleep, kind of fatigue sort of driver impacts have been on a downward trend for the past 5 years. And the vulnerable user, these are the vulnerable user crash rates. Again, seeing a decrease in 2020. Okay, sorry, missed my notes here. But again, the motorcycle and peg crash rates have been on a bit of a decline. The bike crash rate has actually gone up. We did see a decrease in 20. Overall, we'll have to see how that changes in 21. Again, bicycle crashes down in 2020. I guess worth noting that, so for the injury or worse and the fatal, these are all going to be accounted for. I don't know if any of the non-injury or maybe more minor ones would have been reported. So it's possible that one might be a little bit low. But we still had 2 fatal bike crashes in 2020, kind of the same as 19, but the injury rate did fall, so that's encouraging. Again, pedestrians on a downward trend since 2018. And again, the injury is also on a downward trend since 2018. Still had one fatal pedestrian crash in 2020, but still less than 2019 with 3. So as a percentage, vulnerable road users defined as pedestrians, bicycles, and motorcycles make up a pretty small percent, only about 5% of all crashes. Most 95 of our crashes are vehicle only, but disproportionately the vulnerable road users are more severe ones, with almost about like half, almost 50% of fatalities. Some peer city comparisons in the city of Colorado. Longmont's pretty middle of the pack. You can see our 2019 number was quite high even in comparison to some other cities, but our 2020 was actually a little bit lower than some of the comparable ones. So we ended up being lower than Greeley and Pueblo and Lakewood in 2020 with 5. And so this is another comparison of some nationwide cities. This was based on population, exclusively on population numbers that were comparable and available data, which is why a lot of these are from California, Massachusetts, and Washington State. But I think it gives still a pretty decent idea of where we are. And the fatal crash trend has been increasing nationwide. But you can see that even our 2020 number is still relatively low for some of these other ones, but still kind of in the middle in terms of the total fatal crash rate. High crash intersections in the city of Longmont. This is our Class 1A signals, over 25,000 vehicles a day, highest volume. Highway 119 and Main Street is still the number1 intersection. It has been for years. A lot of that is just due to extremely high volume. Notably, there haven't been any fatals in 5 years, but it's still that, and a lot of them are property damage only, but it's still just so many that it's contributing pretty heavily to that. We have seen some, so as part of some of our safety projects, we've seen some of these signals fall out of the top ranking. So like Pike and Main is no longer on here, and it used to be. So some of our improvements have worked to get some of these off of here, but we still see some pretty stubborn. 17th and Main, some of the Highway 66 in Main still high, 119 in Prep Parkway, over in 119. So it's always something we're trying to take a look at and see what we can do.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here a little bit as well. So I think, one of the things to keep in mind is we're doing a 5-year statistical analysis of the data. So when we make a change or an improvement, it's not necessarily going to show up in the data right away. Sometimes they take a few years to shake out. An example like 66 in Maine is one where I think we'll start seeing some improvement. 66 in Maine, you look at that, we had, it's kind of high in here because we did see quite a high number of incapacitating injuries. We had 7 in the last 5 years there. And when we take a deeper look into that data to see what type of crashes those are, what we're really seeing with those is it's kind of the north and southbound left turns. You think about that intersection, it's high speed, potentially limited sight distance if you have a car in the opposing left turn lane. And for north and southbound left turns, it was a permissive left turn. And that's really when we were seeing those crashes happen. And that's the changes that we made this year, was to make those protected only. Now, drawback of that is sometimes those left turns don't clear. And I've definitely gotten a lot of calls about more delay at the intersection for those left turners in particular. But what we're seeing so far in the year is a substantial reduction in those left turn the approach turn type crashes that are really causing those injuries. A handful of others that are on here, we have projects either planned or some stage of design for a lot of these. We can come back to this one if we want to talk about any of these intersections in particular. Also in the report are the rest of the tables for the lower volume signalized intersections, the unsignalized intersections, and some of the road segments, which happy to talk about any of those or some other projects that we've got in the works for those. What do we do with this data and what can we do? I think I mentioned it's identifying the pattern. We look and see where statistically we have an anomaly or a problem. We think this is something that needs a further look. So we'll look further at the data to try and identify the crash type or the pattern. Depending on the problem, we've definitely seen places where signal phasing might be able to make a difference and make a change. So that's a relatively low cost improvement that in some instances is changing a signal head, changing some timing settings on the controller and a sign, and that's a pretty big bang for the buck in terms of return on safety improvement for cost. Other times we're looking at higher dollar improvements. I think Mountain View and Alpine is one that you'll see show up in the chart in the high crash and signalized intersections. But a lot of that is carryover from prior years when it was a high crash location prior to being signalized. So that's where the 5-year data is going to take a while to shake out. But we did a relatively high cost intersection improvement by adding the signal. And we are seeing that those crash numbers go down, particularly in injury crashes.
Another one example of that is 9th and Deerwood, which we signalized at the end of 2018.
And that one was one that was a high crash location, and I think it's fallen off the list here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Caroline. We've done a couple of pedestrian, the mid-block crossings. The one you'll see here was on Mountain View over by Skyline High School. There's a couple more that we've added this year. Some locations we've been able to see a positive improvement in safety, like 9th and Martin is one that's on here. It's a high crash location. We restricted some parking on the southwest corner. And again, early returns, early look on that is that it is reducing the crash and the severity of the crashes at that particular intersection. Sometimes it can be visibility of oncoming traffic. Maybe we need to trim some trees or make the signs more visible can have a big impact. So safety doesn't always have to cost a lot or be expensive. There's often ways that we can achieve a big benefit for a relatively low cost. But there are going to be other projects, other intersections where we have to put in pretty substantial capital costs. I think one that's on here is 17th and Airport that we've looked at. It seems to be on the high crash list year after year. And so we've looked at some options for that. And that's one that's going to be in the higher cost category to improve there. Some of the things we're doing for the vulnerable users or have been doing for the vulnerable users. One is just using a different type of detection. I think either in pavement loops or video optical cameras may be best for detecting pedestrians or bicyclists. Last 3 to 5 years, we've mostly switched out all of our cameras from optical to mostly thermal camera. We do still have some opticals in the field, but a lot of those are being replaced as they're being phased out. We upgrade with new. They really work. They work very well for detecting the heat signature of a person. So I think when we see them at intersections where we're using them to detect bikes, they're relatively effective. We have a lot of intersections where we've also implemented what we call the leading pedestrian interval. And that's where, like Main Street, if you go 4th, 5th, 6th, Longs Peak, and there's a handful of them throughout town where if you're trying to cross the main street, you push the button and the walk comes on a few seconds before the concurrent green phase comes on. So that gives the pedestrians a chance to get out in the street, established and visible before the traffic starts moving. We have an intersection or two where we've used what we call Ped Protect. I think Pike and Airport was the first place we tried that. And quite frankly, that was some feedback we got from our prior TAB members. So definitely willing to take suggestions into account and try things. So what that does is it changes the operation of the left turn based on that button push. So it's If you're trying to cross airport from Clover Basin and you push the button, the left turn will operate in a protected only. So it'll be green arrow, yellow, red, and it will stay red for the duration or for the walk to come on. Instead of that permissive phase where it would be a flashing yellow or just no arrow at all. And I think it's been effective there. And if we have other locations where we're seeing that type of crash pattern, left turners or potentially left turns getting hit, pedestrians getting hit by left turns, that would be a good solution or could be a good solution for some of those intersections. One of the others is where we do what we call float the walk. So that's where the walk will recall, stay on without any input from the user, so that parallel to Main Street, a lot of the intersections we have it running so that if you're trying to cross the avenues parallel to Main, start a green for Main Street, you get a walk that comes on, and the walk will stay on until the end of the phase. So those are just some of the things that we're doing pedestrian wise or vulnerable user wise to try and improve the safety through the use of the signals and some of the tools we have. I guess with that, that's really the meat of our presentation for tonight, and we'll open it up to discussion, questions, any other feedback that the board wants to ask of us.
I just wanted to ask, at the very beginning, you, in your summary to us, you said PWNR, and I don't know what that stands for.
Public Works and Natural Resources.
Okay, thank you. I knew Public Works might have been a part, but okay, natural resources. All right, thank you.
Tyler, I've got a question.
Sure.
As it relates to the vulnerable users and the count, and we saw the numbers go down, of course, but I was curious when you showed in relation to other communities with similar population sets, do we track the gross number of vulnerable users in any sort of way? So we have a meaningful number of, pedestrians and cyclists, because we know obviously by areas based on weather and density and all that, you're going to have a lot more pedestrians than possibly we might have on, say, a road like Airport, right? So do we track anything in regards to the overall total count?
Steve, we don't have a great measure of that, and Phil Greenwald's on the call and might have some more input on any information we have for mode split or share of pedestrians, but the short answer is we really don't have a great way to track the total number of vulnerable users. The best way to do it, unfortunately, is we've got a documented report.
Yeah, fair enough. I figured as much. I didn't know if there'd been any counts or what have you on maybe some of the more traveled, like Maine and that sort of a thing.
So if I could, I guess further on that. So I don't really have any kind of table in the report about it, but I was looking at some of the bikes and pedestrians, trying to see what intersections these are happening at. And the answer is there's no one intersection that, it's a majority of them. It's much more diffused throughout the city. It's more about, there's definitely some general areas that I think are higher risk, especially like North Main Street, like 17th and Main, 23rd and Main, kind of that area. But yeah.
And Phil, I saw you pop in.
Yeah, we don't have a great way to track how many cyclists are in the city or how many pedestrians are. So.
Yeah, good evening to the members and it's Phil Greenwald, Transportation Planning Manager. Tried to do some counts. We've done some at like 3rd and Main of pedestrians and bicyclists only. And so we've tried to come up with those numbers, but we just haven't been consistent because we really rely on volunteers to do those. And so we're looking to how we better count bicyclists and pedestrians in the city and bring it up to the same level that we count automobile traffic, but that hasn't been done yet. So we're hoping to work on that and get better data for you for next time on that. But we have some preliminary data we could share, and we could bring that to you if you'd like at your next meeting.
I'd be interested to see it. Yes.
And I will say that anytime we're doing traffic counts now, wherever we can, like the turning movement counts when you're at an intersection, counting the left, the throughs, and the rights during a peak hour, anytime we're doing those counts, historically we would just count traffic volumes of the cars, but we're definitely counting all users at this point. We're counting all bikes, all peds, so that's all data that we're collecting. Again, it's a snapshot because it's data intensive, right? It's a person out there watching, counting the hours. We have a camera that we've used at a couple of locations, like maybe some particular crossings or request for a crossing. That camera can be pretty useful to get a bigger 24-hour data set that then you can fast forward. There's generally not as many people crossing, but definitely working at improving our tools to be able to capture that data.
Well, I just wanted to thank you all for your efforts the City of Longmont is taking with the Colorado Department of Transportation and the Denver Regional Council on Governments, because for the zero death initiatives, I have seen a number of ads, commercials on TV about pedestrians crossing the street, and some of them are designated specifically for the drivers to pay attention to those pedestrians. But at the same time, other ones are directed to the pedestrians saying, now this isn't the time for you to make sure that your dress or your clothing is styling or whatever, you're to be looking on your phone. You're to be paying attention to what you're doing in crossing the street. And I thought that was really pretty catchy. I hadn't looked at it either way, but I was happy to see. And then it came across that it was being sponsored by the Department of Transportation and the Denver Regional Council on moving towards zero deaths. I thought that was great.
This is David. I want to thank you for sending us the detailed report in our packet. It makes clear just how vulnerable pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorcyclists are when they venture out on Longmont's streets. So please continue your efforts to achieve Longmont's Vision Zero objectives. I do have a few questions. The first one is about tables 8.0 through 8.7. And you showed one of them in your presentation, 8.0, I believe, for the Class 1A intersections. Now, those tables are all based on data from a 5-year period, 2016 to 2020. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, section 6 indicates that during that 5-year period, there were a total of 31 traffic fatalities. But when I look through the tables for all 8 intersection classes and the tables for the high crash non-intersection street sections and added up the entries in the fatalities columns, there were only 8 fatalities. So that's about 26% of the 31 traffic fatalities that occurred during that 5-year period. So my question is, where did the other 23 fatalities occur?
So I think we can definitely, if you're interested in that, we can probably map those. I think that they are generally either not in those high crash segments or the high crash intersections. And just thinking of a couple off the top of my head that may show up in those segments would be potentially like Main Street south of Pike. You know, we had a fatal crash in there, and might be eating my shoe here. I don't think that was in the high crash segment, but that was one location, an example of where we had a fatal crash on Main Street that doesn't necessarily show up in the high crash tables, but definitely was a fatal crash.
So to add to that, I do have that data if you're interested in seeing it. So one example of this would be, so we do There's a number of calculations, but it is weighted based on severity. We have a total, there's like the total number, and then there's a multiplier applied to some of these based on whether it's property damage only, or an injury, incapacitating injury, or a fatal. But sometimes, so say 17th and Gay is didn't come out as a high crash location, and that's usually based on having a composite crash index of 1 or greater. But so there were 2 fatalities at that intersection, even though it didn't calculate out to be a high crash intersection. And overall, the number of crashes wasn't as large as some others. So that's kind of why that happens. So it's not perfect, but like I said, we definitely keep track of where all the fatals are. So if that's something you're interested in seeing, we have that information.
Right, but if by far the majority of the fatal crashes aren't occurring in the places that you identify as high crash locations, what does that tell you about traffic safety?
I think that obviously we all need to be careful as drivers and users, and it can happen anytime and anywhere.
Okay. My next question is about safety features like a crosswalk. How does a safety feature like that come to exist? Is there a requirement that there's a record of crashes at that place? Or are there certain types of places that warrant crosswalks, for example, as a matter of course?
So Board Member McInerney, great question. So we have a pedestrian crossing treatment guideline document that was actually adopted by council in 2009. And it identifies the criteria for new marked crosswalks or removal of existing crosswalks. There's a number of criteria identified in that. A general rule of thumb, the way crosswalk requests come through, I get a phone call, hey, can we have a crosswalk here or this location? And usually it starts with data collection. One of the rule of thumb criteria in that is 20 pedestrians in an hour. It's kind of the baseline number that we're counting. From there, we make some adjustments at the Longmont level. Not everyone does. I've seen Boulder and Lakewood have also kind of taken from our model in terms of we count kids, so any school kids or younger kids that we see crossing, and we're relatively lenient when we're counting the pedestrians crossing in terms of whether it's a kid or an adult. We count them as 2, so 1 kid crossing equals 2 adults crossing in terms of how we weight or do our crosswalk analysis. And similarly for elderly, we do the same thing. So any young or elder, we count double to try and weight that crossing number to get closer to that number, to that 20 peds in an hour if we can. There's some volume requirements too. We say 1,500 cars a day on the street because generally below 1,500, it's a relatively easy street to cross, but definitely we'll evaluate each request on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thanks for that information. It occurred to me last summer, I happened to walk through the intersection of Missouri Avenue and South Pratt Parkway. And there wasn't a crosswalk there, even though Kanemoto Park and a school are in the northwest quadrant of that intersection. So it made me think, what does it take to get a crosswalk?
Are you talking across Missouri or South Pratt?
I don't think there were crosswalks anywhere in that intersection.
So I think we have the underpass under South Pratt, it goes under the north leg. And then on the west leg there, I think it's generally a lower volume street, but definitely something else we can happy to take a look at and see where it's at.
Okay, and now this is the intersection that's adjacent to Kanemoto Park.
Mhm.
Kanemoto Park would be in the northwest quadrant. Okay, and then finally, I've noticed that mid-block pedestrian crossings in another city in Boulder County include a sign that indicates that state law requires motorists to stop for pedestrians in a crosswalk. I haven't seen that kind of sign in Longmont. And in fact, you showed a photograph of a mid-block pedestrian crossing in your presentation. And the only signing there was, you know, a caution type sign with an image of pedestrians. So is the message given at that crosswalk just that there might be pedestrians here?
So I think to start, so state law is not a stop for pedestrian and crosswalk. So I suspect if you're seeing it in another municipality in Boulder County, it probably says yield to pedestrian and crosswalk. Because state law is very clear that it's a yield and not a stop. Some states have a stop to pedestrian and crosswalk. Colorado is a yield. We did have similar signs on Main Street that yield to pedestrian and crosswalk. 287 being a state highway, we were informed by CDOT that we were to remove those signs. They're not compliant with the current MUTCD. So we had many of those on Main Street. They're not there any longer. The pedestrian crossing sign is the sign that's in the manual. That's why that's the one that's more prevalent and probably the most appropriate sign to use for that.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That's it for me.
Thank you, David. I had another question about distracted drivers. Out of the 1,220 crashes in 2020 reported, 177 were reported distracted. Now, I think that's kind of strange. How do you know that? Do they ask them if they're distracted when they have the crash, or do you just make it up? I mean, surely you don't make it up, but how do you, is that a question you ask? Are you a distracted driver?
Chair Stewart, great question. So that statistic is likely underreported because it's a self-report. It's one of, if it's obvious to the officer who's investigating the crash, if they can obviously tell that it was distraction or distracted driver that led to the crash, they would document it that way. Or if the person self-admitted, hey, I was texting and driving and got a true crash while I was texting, that's really the only way to track that.
Okay. So under Section 8, we were talking about high crash locations. Do you find that many of these crashes are caused by high speeds? Do you clock any of that? Do we have any idea that people are going over the speed limit and that's why they've run red lights or whatever?
So,
Yeah,
Yes,
Caroline, do we have this? Yeah, Caroline, jump in on that
Yeah.
one.
So that's a harder question to answer than you might think. So especially if we're looking at, well, one, it's pretty, so citations for safe or exceeded posted speeds are, again, there's not a large number of them. And two, if you try to look at the speed limit versus the reported speed, so your driver at fault might be, say, the left turner, and the left turner's not going very fast, right? And maybe it was hit by someone going 40, but 40 was the speed limit. So it's it's a harder thing to evaluate. And I've tried to,
I think that's
it's definitely a question we get. So
I think that's something that we could look into. We can probably do a comparison and see, maybe not necessarily at fault driver, but which crashes or which number of crashes involved some vehicle exceeding the speed limit, the posted speed. We can probably find that information.
Would it, I wanted to add, I would think that it would be very hard to pin causes of accidents to one factor, because it seems to me, in my experiences, that you might have distracted with high speed, that sort of a thing. So how do you pin down what the actual cause is, right? When we know that it's a variety of factors that kind of play into that. I guess you can't simplify it, right? It's fairly complicated in regards to that.
Yeah, and so 2021 is a transition year. So the state report for crashes has substantially changed over the past. And there are a lot more fields of data that go into that report. And it has much more information in terms of proximate cause, secondary cause, any other additional factors that may have led to that crash. So moving forward, we will have probably better data to be able to answer that particular question. But it's going to take a little bit to get that data built up still.
That's good to hear. I'm glad that you're going to start tracking that, and this report is well done. Thank you.
And I just see a message popping through from Councilmember Peck. I think she has another engagement to run to tonight. So congratulations.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, Liz.
How much, as the city approves developments, so a different department approves new developments, is there anticipatory changes that the transportation department looks at? What I'm thinking about is I noticed in these things that Main Street between 15th and 17th is already a really heavy area of non-intersection crashes. And I know that the city's looking at approving several hundred apartments in that same block. And I'm wondering if there's any planning on that that's being anticipated.
Sure. So I think the best thing I can talk about on that is we kind of the end of 2019, we kicked off that Main Street corridor plan. And one of the efforts of that, or one of the things that identified, was to look at any way we can consolidate access or access locations along there. And it's definitely one that's going to be a multi-year project. Main Street's a large corridor. And we have other high crash locations along the corridor. And I think the first step that we're looking at that went into the budget for 2021 or 2022 is that kind of the North Main part, start looking on some type of access management, safety plan for that. And then we would work down as we go. But in terms of development on 15th or related to that, we're definitely looking at that Main Street corridor plan. And if there's any parts of that that they can implement with the development, we'd either be asking for, can you do some of these improvements, or make sure not to put your building where we need to do something, right?
Okay. I know that there's a lot being planned for that segment. So
I had a question about that. We had talked in previous time about the long blocks north of 19th, that there were a lot of people crossing middle of the block. And I don't know if anything is in the North Main plan about mid-block crossings, because we had discussed it a while ago, but I was wondering if there was anything coming up for that.
And Board Member Michelle, that's definitely one, I think, one that I've mentioned a handful of times, and one that I see seems like every time I drive North Main, is that crossing just south of the King Supers there. There's the bus stop on both sides, and there's a retirement home, I believe, or some type of elderly facility on the east side behind the Taco Bell there. I think I see people crossing in the middle of the street there almost every time I drive through there. And to me, that's one that's like, we need to do something to help this crossing out. So that's definitely one of the crossings we're going to be looking at as we kick off our North Main efforts in 2022.
And to add to that, I know that in the Main Street corridor plan, I think it calls for most segments of Main having a center median. But I don't know beyond that if there's any specific, mid-block crossings. Like I don't planned in that median at all. But
so one of the other projects coming out of that plan for next year that we're anticipating kicking off would be an underpass at 21st and Main. Again, not a bid block, but another opportunity to provide some additional safe crossing of Main Street.
Great, thank you.
I would
Any
also
other
just, if I could just throw in one quick comment, is when we look at, and nobody likes when I say this, but I'm going to say it, is when you look at other cities with more congestion, where the traffic has to go slower, or there's more conflict, so you have to keep your eyes open and keep your wits about you and not be distracted. that actually lowers the crash rate for, especially for the vulnerable populations that we've been talking about. So you'll see in some of these comparison cities, if you look at some of them, you'll see that they are notorious for having high congestion, and it's something we're not, we're trying to balance between the congestion levels and the safety levels. But when people are going slower because there's more cars, it does tend to affect that crash rate in a positive way.
It can affect your mode choice as well.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. So we're going to hear from board members, and I'll just start with Courtney Michelle. Do you have any comments?
Nothing except to Phil's point, I would imagine if there is more congestion, that there are also not as many pedestrians trying to run across the street to try to, because there's no breaks in traffic. So I would imagine that might make a difference as well. Not that we want more congestion, but if there's cars the entire way, that would make sense that people aren't trying to weave in and out of there or run across. So something to consider. But I always, even though we have had some fatalities, I'm happy that ours is comparatively lower than same size cities in the state and other places. So that is positive. Thank you.
Liz, do you have any comments?
First, thanks to Carolyn and Tyler and all the staff that prepared this. And I just wanted to say that I personally really appreciate the new four-way stops on 19th. That makes me, as I'm driving, feel a whole lot safer. And so thank you for those.
Steve?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just thank you to the staff for putting together this report. And this data is great to look at, and I would agree with all the prior comments.
And David?
No further comments from me. I just want to thank staff for the presentation. It's very informative.
And I as well want to thank you all for your hard work. And it was really good. And it was very positive to read that the report for a total number of injuries or worse crashes were the lowest level, even though since 1996, but even though maybe it wasn't as totally accurate as you would like. But I also wanted to comment that I want to thank Phil Greenwald and all the staff that were involved in the Kaufman Street open house display and presentation in September. I went, and while I was there, I saw a number of community members interacting with staff, asking questions and giving suggestions about the project. And I thought that we really had good community engagement, and I hope that you all did too. And I really thank you for your efforts. That was really good. And I have been attending the statewide greenhouse gas reduction rulemaking meetings, and I went to some of them in September and October as well. And I've learned a lot by going to those meetings because I was unaware of the rural community and the mountain community and the concerns that they have about the rules that are being projected. But the bottom line is they all seem to be lacking infrastructure. And so I'm hoping that things will be changing. And anyway, I know that there's going to be one more greenhouse gas meeting, reduction rulemaking meeting on Wednesday. So if people want to go virtual, they can sign up and do that. So anyway, thank you. Thank you all for your good efforts. All right, Councilman Peck is gone, but she's Mayor Peck now. Is there any information on upcoming transportation meetings that you want to share with us?
I don't have any right now. If any come up, we'll make sure to get them out to the board. I think on a year end here, we might not see as many.
Okay.
Also, I have some information on that meeting that you just mentioned on the 10th. on Wednesday. So I will send that out to the group if anybody else wants to link into that and just listen in or make comments.
Yeah, you can make comments, but you need to tell them you're going to do that. Yeah.
And we have a number of city staff members all throughout the various professions that we have at the city staff level tracking this data. So we have air quality folks, we have sustainability folks, we have transportation folks, and some other folks, power and communications folks tracking this for the city. So please don't think it's happening kind of in a vacuum, that we're not tracking this. We're very interested to see what the rulemaking is on this, and have made suggestions on how to change the rules to be fair for all. So thanks for that information.
Yeah,
Stuart.
and be equitable. Yeah, thank you. All right, so our next meeting, December 13th, we're going to be having your work plan for 2022 and the annual report for 2021, correct?
That's what we have on here right now. So I would encourage any board members, if you have any ideas, I'm happy to share maybe some of the new board members might not have seen or have access. It's on one of the agendas, but want to make sure that everyone has the current work plan. A lot of the items that show up on the work plan are kind of a recurring basis, regular updates that we provide to the board, both working with RTD, handful of big studies that are going on. If there's any major land use changes, those may come to the board. There are a handful of things that we bring to the board every year, but if there's anything on there that you feel we're missing, happy to take input. This board's been pretty good about providing input or bringing topics that they want to discuss to the table. So appreciate all your efforts and the time that you guys give to the community.
Thank you. Now, do I need to ask if the caller had any questions again, Tyler?
Generally, no.
Okay.
I think if the board if you wanted to make a motion for final call, public invited to be heard, you could do so.
Would someone like to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll make a motion for final call for any public comment.
I'll second that.
Okay, second by Liz. Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone that would like to make a comment that had called in?
Hello, this is Diane Christ again.
Yes, Diane.
Thank you for opening it up for comment. I do have just a point of clarification. I don't have the value of having the presentation in front of me, but when we're talking about vulnerable individuals or bicyclists and pedestrians, is that data all accidents with vehicles, or is there any data regarding pedestrians and bicycles together?
These would be crash reports, vehicle and vehicle pad, vehicle bike. I'm not aware that we have any reports of, say, bicycle pad or ped bike or bike crashes.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other?
It was fascinating information. Thank you for sharing that and including me this evening.
Well, thank you, Diane, for joining us. All right, any other comments before I adjourn this meeting? All right, meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
All have a good evening.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.